Yeah, so my name is Wikke Jansen. I'm doing or actually just submitted my PhD at the Institute of Asian and African Studies at Humboldt University. And I'm a fellow at the Berlin Graduate School, Muslim Cultures and Societies. My PhD project focused on the interaction between religion, activism, and everyday life among queer Indonesians. And in this short talk, I will go into like the trajectories of naming and opposition to gender and sexual diversity in Indonesia, and the strategies of appropriation and counter-appropriation that factor into this. And then after that, we will have a talk by Mehmet on anti-LGBTQ discourses in Turkey. And Mehmet is currently doing his MA in sociology at the FU Berlin, and he's also part of the project Secularity, Islam and Democracy in Indonesia and Turkey, led by Dr. Saskia Schäfer. Where he focuses on various topics relating to Turkish politics, such as discourses on democracy and conspiracy narratives. Mehmet, could you? Yeah, thank you. So in Indonesia, the vocabulary when it comes to gender and sexual diversity has changed a lot since the pre-colonial period. For a long time in Indonesia, same-sex sexuality and non-normative gender practices had not been subjected to a lot of explicit backlash. But this all changed during the colonial period, specifically because Dutch colonial anxieties over gender and sexual diversity were brought into the region. And Michael Pellets has done a lot of research on early modern Southeast Asia, and he's pointed out that this notion of like gender pluralism, which was pervasive during this period in the region, meaning that gender binaries were not so strict, that the divine was often conceptualized as more fluid or being of two genders or sexes. And this also meant that transgendered individuals were in certain contexts accorded a special or revered status, and that in certain ritual settings, they were accorded divine qualities sometimes, or at least had a very important role in these rituals. And this harsh rejection of same-sex sexuality and gender transgressive behavior or appearance that we see today does not seem to have been common at all. And this only entered what is now called Indonesia with the start of the colonial era, where the Dutch colonial government equated the colonized people with deviance and perversion and started to come down very harshly on homosexuality especially. And this era also brought with it increased rigidity of gender and sexuality categories. So this very binary system, which was what was common in Western thought and science at the time. You could say in many ways it still is. And there's several other factors that have contributed to this decrease in gender pluralism, such as modernization of Islam and bureaucratization and processes of globalization as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so it's in this context that during the last few decades, the visibility of LGBTQ individuals and groups in Indonesia has really increased. And this visibility is related to international developments as well, processes of globalization, for example, the increased access to online media from the US and Europe, but also increasing anxieties over non-normative sexuality and gender in the Asia-Pacific region in general. For example, in Malaysia and Singapore, where this like Asian values narrative has delegated sexual and gender diversity to the realm of Western oppression. It's also related to the overturn of the ban on homosexual intercourse in India in 2018, the legalization of same-sex marriage in Australia in 2017 and in Taiwan in 2019. And so a lot of things that came together to kind of change the discourse and make these groups more visible. So the terms gay and lesbian as identity markers started circulating in Indonesia in the 1970s, and a little bit later also the terms trans woman and trans man, and the umbrella term LGBT. And with this, communities and activist groups have also started forming. And at the same time, this has gone hand in hand with increased discrimination and violence towards queer Indonesians. And this development kind of spiked in 2016 with widespread backlash against the LGBT or queer community in Indonesia. For example, there have been highly publicized public canings of alleged gay and lesbian Indonesians in Aceh. There's been a police raid, like a very large police raid on an alleged gay sauna in Jakarta, where 140 men were arrested. And there have been many other such instances of vigilante and state violence and discrimination. And the interesting thing is that while the term LGBT has given these gender and sexual minorities in Indonesia kind of banner to organize against, it's also kind of this comprehensive quality of it that makes it easy for opponents to discriminate across this whole spectrum. Because like on the one hand, labels are definitely important within the LGBT community. The overarching term has been really used as a collective identity marker rather than a very specific individual one. And its usage is also has not been restricted to the letters that make up the acronym lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, but for example, during my fieldwork, many Warias describe themselves as LGBT as well. And Waria is a category that has existed much longer in Indonesia than the term LGBT. And sometimes it's considered like kind of as a precursor to this term, but many Warias also contest this. Yeah, so the word Waria is like a portmanteau of the Indonesian words for man and woman, wanita and pria, and it describes, pria and wanita, and it describes a wide range of individuals who were assigned male at birth, but in one form or another integrate femininity into their sense of self and or self-expression. And Waria communities have traditionally been very tight-knit and at the same time accepted in society in certain ceremonial roles, but they've also been excluded from the regular job market and education and have had to endure a lot of stigmatization. So despite this very different origin of the concept of Waria from the more recent categories, for example, gay and lesbian, which are maybe like more rigid in what they are supposed to define, many Warias still consider themselves to be part of this imagined community of LGBT Indonesians. And the same goes for other categories that are actually not linguistically included in the term LGBT. For example, tomboys and butchy individuals who were assigned female at birth, but to a certain extent identify or present more masculine. And more recently, also people identifying as non-binary or genderqueer. But they still would, like recognize themselves as part of this LGBT community. And then more recently, we have like more the term queer coming in Indonesia, but first I wanted to go into the usage of the term LGBT by opponents, and then we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So interestingly enough, like political and religious opponents in Indonesia are very well versed in this whole LGBT vocabulary, and they've actually, I think, contributed to its popularization and the general public's familiarity with the term. There are a few events that have played a role in this. For example, in 2014, the biggest Muslim body in Indonesia, the Majelis Ulama Indonesia, or MUI, has issued a fatwa or religious opinion where they prohibited and denounced any form of non-normative sexuality as sins. And in this fatwa, they really reveal their familiarity with these new categories such as gay, lesbian, and bisex, and describe in detail like what these terms mean. And they use like these words from international discourse such as sexual orientation, same sex, and attraction, which is like quite interesting if you're so against it, to kind of appropriate this vocabulary in a way. And other examples include a statement by a collective of religious leaders in 2016, which advocated an approach towards the LGBT community of tolerance, but also like to cure and reform. And you can see some other interesting examples on the slide. For example, two men in a demonstration in Aceh, like in the middle at the top, who are wearing t-shirts that say no lesbian, no gay, no bisexual, no transgender, anti-LGBT. And on the left-hand corner, on the bottom, there's an Instagram post that if you didn't know Indonesian, you would surely think that's like a queer affirming organization advertising an event with the rainbow colors and the hearts and the word feminism, and like in the corner you can see like this diverse group of women holding a woman's symbol and saying girl power. But actually this is a banner that says the dangers of LGBT, and it's an advertisement for an anti-LGBT and feminism lecture by Henry Salahuddin, who is a professor in Gontor in East Java. And he writes a lot about like against Muslim feminism and LGBTQ friendly Muslim scholarship. So yeah, this is so kinds of points to the ways that LGBT and its visual symbolism have been appropriated by these opposing actors in order to stigmatize the community and to to incite like more fear and hatred against those who are associated with that label. Yeah, and just to round us off before passing on to Mehmet, I want to briefly touch upon some of the ways in which this appropriation by opposing groups has been countered in Indonesia. Yeah, thanks. And this is where the popularization of the term queer comes in, as more and more Indonesians, especially those from like the younger generations and probably like middle and upper class backgrounds, have started to use this term in order to distance themselves from the stigmas associated with the word LGBT. Although personally, I haven't really heard anyone reject that term, but it's still like considered to be the same community, but also sometimes used to like subvert scrutiny by fundamentalist groups or the government who might not like be aware of this term queer yet. And what I find very interesting is this is kind of an inversion of how it went with like US terminology, where like in the US terms like queer started as an insult and were then appropriated by the community. And in the Indonesian context, it's kind of the opponents who are running behind the facts and have to keep up with the development of language if they want to target minorities effectively. And then, yeah, so one important aspect of this counter-appropriation by queer LGBT Indonesians has been this impulse to define, explain, and educate the people about the terminology. This happens within like closed circles, for example, some religious figures like Reverend Suleiman, who recently passed away, was a very important figure in this. And he like advocated together with other Christian and Muslim leaders for the reinterpretation of sexual and gender diversity within religious sources, and linguistic analysis of these sources has also played an important role in this. And then from a completely different angle, there have been a number of social media initiatives hoping to educate people. For example, Kamus Queer is an Instagram platform that explains this queer-related terminology and categories in like plain Bahasa Indonesia for everyone to understand in order to like counter misinformation and stereotypes. So I'm very sorry, I think I've been talking a little bit too long, so I'm now gonna pass on to Mehmet. I hope I've been able to like convey some of the most important issues of sexual and gender diversity in the Indonesian context in terms of language. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wikke. In my part of the presentation, I will focus more on this past 20 years and how this anti-LGBTQI discourse sort of been developed throughout the past 20 years of AKP government. I think timeline-wise, the way that the LGBT movement sort of raised up in Indonesia and in Turkey and how they are being declined is quite similar. And also the narratives of the religious stories are also quite similar in terms of alienation. So I think there are like lots of parallel lines that we can draw between these two developments. So now we're gonna talk more about the Turkey part. I won't talk much about the pre-AKP era because even though the state and society was strictly heteronormative, the real actual anti-LGBTQI discourse and a pro-LGBTQI discourse and its NGOization started more in the past years of Turkey, starting from the 1990s onwards. 1980s military coup sort of was like the thing that stopped all sort of civil movements in Turkey. That's why all sort of any sort of civil movements and NGOizations had to wait until 1990s, where Turkey became more of a part of the liberal economy and Western agenda and so on. So therefore, 1990s stand as a time that the LGBTs first started to find each other in the cities and form their first informal communities. Also, it's the time that they started to cultivate, to develop this sort of understanding about equal rights and citizenship. It should be worth to mention that the citizenship rights were not focusing on the equal marriage and parenting rights, but they were more focusing on the employment and non-discrimination laws and such, because the LGBT movement itself was also sort of afraid about the fact that Turkey is culturally and morally not ready to embrace such a big rights movement. So they were more trying to go in the winnable fights in the beginning. So that was the main focus. And then AKP, detached from a political Islamist party as an anti-EU party, positioned itself as like a center-right party, that is like conservative Democrat, just like CDUs of Germany. And they were like promising more democratization and liberalization for all segments of society. And this promise was firstly made on the conservative electorate of the Turkey from Anatolia, but also it was giving this promise both to the socialists and liberals and LGBTQI community as well. In this first years of the Europeanization of Turkey, after the first years of AKP, the NGOs engaging in political struggles were legalized, so it allowed the formal recognition of the LGBTQI NGOs. Also, the first Pride March organized in 2003 in this first years of AKP government. And in these years, we see like a very big inflow of capital from European Union and from Western powers to Turkey, as Turkey strictly follows this European Union program and IMF program. So this funding and cultural know-how and education and so on sort of created the LGBTQI movement to be more rights demanding and to be more organized in a citizenship model. So in these years could be seen as like the early 2000s as like the blossoming of this entire movement that we have seen in Turkey. And also in this slide, you see some of the statements coming from the top AKP elite in these years. And their statements, they all sort of agree the fact that LGBTQI rights will not be achievable in Turkey in the short run. But yet the discourse that they are using is mostly referencing to EU and legal frames. So what we see here is that even though that it's like a non-anti-LGBTQI discourse, the ball is often thrown to the EU's court. And the main claim was that there is like an EU constitution that is on the preparation, and Turkey should wait out for EU to prepare those rights and duties for the citizenship of LGBTQI people, so Turkey can import those rights. So in these early years, we see a more of a logical explanations coming from the AKP elite, showing more legal and societal connections of that without referencing to religion or moral codes. But then in 2013, between 2013 and 2016, we can consider this as like more like a transition period of AKP. 2013 was a breaking point for the party because it had separation with its Gulenist fraction within the party. And also there was like the first time that we see a very big popular opposition against AKP in form of public protestations called Gezi Park movements. And this movement was uniting all the LGBTQI, leftist, Kurdish, and secular Kemalists and secular nationalists, anyone that is sort of feel distressed about the AKP's tendency of authoritarianization and Islamization. They went out for the streets, and LGBTQI people were also very visible and upfront in these protestations. So with this 2013 turning point, also 2013 Pride was the crowdest Pride that has ever been attended in Turkey, with more than 100,000 people attending. And with this year, we started to see more of a AKP's discourse shifting towards us versus them, as like the anyone that is sort of opposing the party's agenda is being labeled as terrorists, and as the groups working with the external foci trying to undermine Turkey. So in this transition period, we see the discourse shifting towards a more populist and more aggressive language by AKP elite. So the LGBTQI movement and AKP's discourses against it in these transition periods shows us both the signs from the liberal era of AKP in the past and the upcoming authoritarian rule that is going to come in the following years. What I mean by that is that when you look at the pictures of the presentation, we see this one news say gays are everywhere. This was like a very, very small group emerged in 2013, and they were joining to the rallies of the Erdogan. And they were claiming themselves as a pro-LGBT rights movement that is also pro-AKP and pro-Erdogan. And the movement lasted only a couple of like months, and now they have like 10 followers in Twitter, and it's already disappeared. And on the bottom left, we see like an election pamphlet of 2015 from AKP, and they claim that AKP is the most liberal democratic party because the fact that the Pride March can be done during the Ramadan month in Turkey shows how liberal and open-minded AKP can be towards the other lifestyles. That's the main claim of the AKP in these eras. But also in the same election of 2015, when HDP, the Kurdish party, nominated an homosexual person as a candidate for member of parliament, the same AKP's prime minister referred to the history of the mythology of the Lut tribe from Islam history. And this story means that there's like a old tribe called Lut that were involving in an immoral sexual actions, which was destroyed by the God's wrath. The fact that HDP nominating an LGBTQI member as a candidate reacted by the AKP elite in that, with the reaction of this mythology being told, which shows that AKP is playing to both different electorates. On the one hand, instrumentalize the LGBT movement as a sign of their liberal part, while they're using a highly religious and familial discourse on the other hand for their conservative electorate at the same time. Later on, in 2016, we see another breaking point that is for Turkey and AKP. There was like a failing peace process with the Kurdish guerrilla, and a coup attempt happened in 2016. And this transformed AKP to a completely paranoid state of mind, seeing enemies everywhere and increasing the oppression of any sort of civil movement, legal opposition parties and media outlets and citizens and such. And in this process, party became the state more. There were like 2 years of state of emergency that was being in the power, and all these gaps of cadres from the Gülenist people were filled with the other religious sects that are known to be more fundamentally religious and Islamist. So in this time period, we see that also the discourse of AKP becoming more hostile and more us versus them, presenting themselves as a national, while the other parts are presented as like an external Fuji, or like trying to undermine Turkey's great march or so, and also more towards a nationalist Islamist ideology. That's also when LGBTQI communities started to face a very, very harsh measures from this year on. All the LGBT-related events in capital Ankara were banned in 2016 until a further notice, because they are open to provocation. Similar actions started to be observed around the country about all sorts of civil movements. Also, 2015 was the first year that the Pride March was attacked by the police with tear gas and the plastic bullets. And this formed itself to be a new tradition that is going to follow every year. And ever since, every Pride March or any sort of queer activism faces strong violence and arrestations coming from the police side. So there we can see like a sort of a correlation between AKP's authoritarianization, more use of the nationalist religious narrative, and oppression regarding these civil movements and LGBT movements. VS in Bosnia defines political homophobia as like a purposeful strategy to create us and scapegoating the other in form of building this national identity. Slepkov also defines it as like an oppressive strategy to build the notion of us and show countries' particular values different than the West. So all these periods happening in between 16 and 19, and the discourse of the AKP using more religious references from 2016 onwards, like a Lut tribe or familial codes and such, shows us the way of using anti-LGBTQI discourse as an identity of us versus them. And I think one of the biggest conflicts about the LGBTQI rights happened in 2019, 2020. In 2020, president of the Diyanet, the religious authorities of Turkey, referenced to the Lut tribe when he was explaining about the COVID pandemic. He mentioned that when there is like a sort of an immoral actions coming from LGBTQI, just like the Lut tribe, the God sends its wrath in form of a disease like HIV. This statement came in the middle of a pandemic crisis, so it was obviously sort of referring to the LGBTQI community as a responsible subjects for the ongoing COVID pandemic. This was denounced immediately by the Turkish Bar Association, claiming that he is being against the constitution and against equal citizenship rights and against the human rights. But statements of the Ali Erbash were supported unquestionably by Erdogan, and he claimed that their statement against Ali Erbash and the wording of it became an intentional attack to the Islam, and the attack is against our state. This was one of the very important statements, I would say, because it's a turning point for a Turkey that has been strictly secular in terms of state bureaucracy for the past years. Is the first time using Islam as a state itself, or state itself as an Islam, and equates these two distinct things that were in Turkish past for the past years. One particular event happened in 2021, I think shows us like a very good example about how this narrative is being instrumentalized. So what happened in Boğaziçi University is completely relevant from LGBT movement, and it's rather a clash between university and scholars who defend autonomous university and AKP authoritarianism. But the way it transformed and narrowed down to LGBT struggle gives us a hint about how this discourse is being instrumentalized by the AKP elite. So Boğaziçi University is one of the most liberal and prestigious public university in Turkey. It has like a it is notorious globally and in country for its democratic structures, its liberal student environment, and so on. There you can see like an LGBTQI student tent next to a Marxist-Leninist tent next to one political Islamist one. So it shows us like a very much of a free and liberal environment. What happened there was a like, top-down rector appointment happened in 2nd of January in 2021. And Erdogan appointed like a person without a merit as a rector of the university. And it evoked like a huge public outrage in forms of protestation by students and scholars and its alumni. When we had this situation, it went out for like a month with the first more got along reactions from state claimed students to be terrorists that are trying to undermine the stability of the state and such, which we have been seeing as an excuses for like the past 10 years. So it's not something very, very surprising as a Turkish citizen. But yet this Boğaziçi alumni and students were also very smart in using their social media networks and such. So the public perceivance about the issue was seeing Erdogan and AKP in a wrong position. According to survey results that we see in January 2021, 69% of the sample was saying that the Erdogan's actions against the university was wrong. Also, half of the AKP electorate itself found that this is a very, very wrong action that Erdogan and AKP is doing. So in the beginning, the discourse about the free academia seemed to be working against Erdogan. But what happened then is that on 29th of January, during an art exhibition was organized by the students with the contribution of anonymous artists. And one of the images in the exhibition was basically what AKP needed. The image that I show you in the presentation is like a figure depicting Islam's holy shrine Kaaba with a mythological figure of female snake in the center, and with the four corners with the images of the transsexuality flag and LGBTQI flag and so on. Far-right media picked up this image immediately and started to circulate that in their media outlets, with the main argument being the provoking students of Boğaziçi University insult and harass the religious values of Muslim majority. The news of Yeni Akit picked up immediately by the state elite, and then it gave the legitimization for the state's actions against the university arrived. Boğaziçi was the main institution of that spreads foreign ideologies in Turkey, such as LGBTQI, and it was poisoning our smart youth and eventually making them spies working for external Foci trying to undermine Turkey. The following statements made by high-level state elite right after the spread of such news are like seen in the presentation. The Minister of Internal Affairs on the same day that the names came out announced that the 4 LGBTQI deviants are arrested who committed disrespect against our Kaaba, the holy shrine. With the target becoming more clear, anti-terror police started to raid students' houses in the morning after 5 a.m. with heavy weapons. They also started to raid the LGBTQI club building in the university, and they seized a book with the terrorist group PKK symbol and LGBT flags. The wording here is also quite important because LGBTQI rainbow flag is also framed as something to be seized, like a weapon found, or like a forbidden book or such, or a symbol showing a terrorist organization's banner or such. And abbreviations are a very important part of Turkish, like AKP's narrative, I think, in instrumentalizing the Turkey to enhance the climate of fear. Usually after any sort of civil opposing movement ending with the police's arrestation, a statement comes from Ministry of Internal Affairs, and they list up those lists, like saying that there is a DHKPC members, as well as number of FETÖ members, or MLKPD, or PKK, or PYD, or KHK, or whatever. There's like a very long list of these abbreviations that they are using to show that there is like a plenty of terrorist organizations working, trying to undermine the Turkey's stability and growth. LGBTQI as an abbreviation for a gender identity fit perfectly for their strategy. So it just started to become another terrorist organization that they can add up to their lists pretty much. As a matter of fact, during the court process of the students arrested in the protestations, the judge himself asked students if they are a member of LGBTQI, assuming that it's like an organization that you can be a member of like any other civil movements. Süleyman Soylu, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, also asked in this time period about Why do they help? Pointing out the international funds LGBTQI NGOs are receiving from the European Union and such. And this narrative sort of connect together as like narratives of conspiracy theories trying to undermine Turkey's stability, anti-LGBTQI and anti-European Union and anti-West. They sort of lumped together in the same bag, and they work together as the different discourses that are empowering each other in terms of alienating the community. So in this short story of Boğaziçi University, actually, we see a very strategic and very clever use of anti-LGBTQI discourse by AKP elite to distract society from the actual demands of the movement and eventually legitimizing it from the long run. It started as a free academia movement at first with a great acceptance by the society, but after a month, when it turned to the LGBT movement, we started to see the loss of its social capacity to a great extent. Also, Turkey is a country that is consuming these political scandals and clashes and topics in the speed of light. So everything changes very, very fast in the country nowadays. So none of these struggles can stay on the news for more than like 2-3 weeks. So with this discursive shift, AKP created from the free academia to LGBT movement, government gained enough time to manipulate the news and distract it with the LGBTQI focused discussions. And in the long run, the focus of the news and society were eventually distracted with the other news related to COVID and ongoing economic crisis and other daily political news. So today, even though resistance continues silently in university campus and nothing has changed ever since, there are no media outlets or public discussions covering it. And the LGBT hate definitely increased thanks to like with this news and agenda going on. But they were not trying to even articulate the LGBT hate, but more like using it as an instrument to change the discursive narrative of the news going about any sort of civil movement. So today, AKP started to change the academic schedules of the university, opening new institutions and terminating contracts of the teachers, and they increasing control over the last liberal democratic strongholds of Turkey, but yet it is even further forgotten. So what is it about? Is it really about LGBTQI, really? The simple cultural explanations driving correlations between Islam and political homophobia appears to be way too simplistic, especially when we consider the evolution of this discourse in Turkey in the just past 20 years, while it has been like a Muslim country for more than like centuries or so. So back to the Slepkov and VS and Bosnia, we see that it's like a strategy of building an us versus them. So here LGBTQI or anti-LGBTQI discourse is being used strategically to build a collective of us that are being national and from local, and them that are being from the external, who are getting funded by the European Union and from getting funded by the external enemies of the Turkey and so on. Also, this sort of distractions, I would say, also created in terms of to hide the ongoing economic crisis, growing oligarchy, and authoritarianism. Also, this sort of news help AKP to legitimize their security politics more and more on a daily basis on the people.